whoever governs Singapore must have that iron in him.
Look at this map, and you will notice a tiny red dot so small, it is almost anonymous, lost in the vastness of the ocean. An island with no natural resources, no fresh water, and not even a single stretch of arable land that could be taken for granted. And yet, in just a few short decades, this barren patch of earth transformed itself into one of the wealthiest nations on the planet, a place where dreams of prosperity were realized in the most improbable way imaginable. The man who sculpted this miracle once left behind a declaration as hard as steel. Anyone who wished to lead Singapore had to possess an unbreakable will. He looked at the muddy swamps of the past and proclaimed, without hesitation, that this place would become a great metropolis and that fear was not an option. This was not merely a promise, it was a life-or-death oath made by Lee Kuan Yew, the man who carried Singapore across the invisible line separating the third world from the ranks of the world's leading nations. To understand how one man could reshape the destiny of millions, we must travel back in time to the legend known as the Lion City. Ancient tales recount that in the 11th century, a prince from Sumatra sailed past this island, amid its raw, untamed landscape. He encountered a creature before him majestic and powerful, bearing the likeness of a lion. From that moment on, the name Singapore, meaning Lion City in Malay, was born. Yet the island remained asleep, locked in the form of a remote fishing village, forgotten in the middle of the endless sea, defined by its primitive geography. That slumber lasted until the early 19th century, when British footsteps reached its shores and irrevocably altered its fate. In 1819, Stamford Raffles, an ambitious official of the East India Company, recognized Singapore as a strategic chess piece, one capable of breaking Dutch dominance over Southeast Asian trade and expanding the reach of the British Empire. He brought with him not only diplomatic treaties, but also laid the foundations for a controversial process of modernization. From an isolated outpost, Singapore entered nearly 2 centuries of colonial rule. The first bricks of a bustling port were laid, drawing waves of people from across the world, all chasing the promise of wealth and opportunity. Yet behind the glittering facade of a global trading hub lay the cold logic of colonialism, where imperial interests always came first. It was within the shadows of dependence and during those early years of the colonial era that a steely resolve began to form in the hearts of the local people, an iron will, waiting for its moment to erupt to seize history with its own hands and rewrite it on its own terms. The story of this island did not begin with gleaming skyscrapers, but with a legend rich in symbolism. In the 11th century, a prince from Sumatra, during one of his sea voyages, set foot on a wild and untouched island. Amid dense thickets of trees, he suddenly caught sight of a powerful creature, a beast, bearing the majestic form of a lion. That moment compelled him to name the place Singapura, which in Malay means the Lion City. Historical evidence suggests that the animal he saw was most likely a tiger rather than a lion. Yet the name endured, binding itself to the island's destiny for centuries. Like a prophecy of a latent power waiting patiently for the day it would awaken. For many centuries afterward, Singapore remained a quiet fishing village, resting silently along the coast until the early 19th century. Everything truly changed in 1819, when Stamford Raffles, a diligent official of the British East India Company, arrived on its shores. At the time, the British Empire was eager to secure a strategic foothold to break Dutch commercial dominance in Southeast Asia. Raffles recognized this island as a golden location, a gateway linking the most critical maritime trade routes. After signing a treaty with the Sultan of Johor, the British were officially granted permission to establish a trading post here, ushering in nearly 2 centuries of rule under the British Crown. Yet behind the label of a free trade port and the veneer of Western civilization lay a colonial logic that was brutally cold and calculating. To maximize profits for the colonial administration, the British transformed Singapore into a massive center for processing and distributing opium. Opium was imported from India, stockpiled in Singapore, and then funneled into China, directly fueling the bloody conflicts that erupted in the mid-19th century. Not stopping there, in order to further boost colonial revenues, Raffles and the authorities of the time legalized and industrialized both gambling and prostitution. They even imported labor from Eastern Europe to sustain these activities. This was the naked truth of how an empire functioned. Human dignity and moral considerations were pushed aside to make room for rising financial figures. Alongside exploitation, the colonial government carried out an urban restructuring that deeply entrenched ethnic divisions. The island was carved into separate zones for the Chinese, Malays, Europeans, and Arabs. On the surface, the system created a semblance of stability, allowing different communities to coexist with minimal direct conflict. In reality, it was a deliberate strategy designed to make governance easier. Singapore rapidly grew into one of Southeast Asia's busiest ports, drawing merchants from across the world, with goods flowing endlessly through its harbors. By the end of the 19th century, Singapore's economy had reached unprecedented levels of prosperity, with trade expanding eightfold. Yet this wealth flowed primarily into the pockets of Western rulers. The local population and immigrant laborers were merely cogs in a vast money-making machine, where their welfare always ranked below imperial interests. It was this subtle yet relentless exploitation, this chilling colonial logic, that quietly planted the seeds of discontent. In the hearts of the people, they began to realize that no matter how vibrant the city became, they remained laborers on their own land. Prosperity built on opium and gambling could never serve as a sustainable foundation for an independent nation. And it was precisely this realization that laid the silent groundwork for a powerful awakening to come when the island would no longer accept being a pawn on someone else's chessboard. But the prosperity built upon the foundations of colonial rule collapsed in a single violent moment of history. On December 7, 1941, when bombs thundered across the sky at Pearl Harbor, a new chapter written in blood and tears opened for all of Southeast Asia. Imperial Japan made no attempt to hide its ambition to seize the region's vast natural resources. And to achieve that goal, one obstacle had to be removed. Singapore, the most vital political and economic stronghold of the British in Asia. On February 1, 1942, Japanese forces launched a full-scale assault on the island. Faced with a ferocious and battle-hardened enemy, the people of Singapore across all ethnic lines rose spontaneously, taking up arms to defend their families and the land they called home. Yet a bitter reality soon revealed itself. Those who claimed to be protectors, the mighty British Empire with more than 2 centuries of dominance, collapsed. With stunning speed, British strategy at the time focused almost entirely on defending the homeland, leaving Singapore starved of reinforcements and weaponry. Within just a few short weeks, after a string of crushing defeats, British forces chose unconditional surrender. The fall of Singapore was not merely a military defeat. It was a devastating psychological shock. People stood stunned, realizing that the empire they had once believed to be invincible could, in fact, be brought to its knees. More importantly, they grasped a harsh truth. Foreign powers would never protect them to the very end. If they were to survive, they could rely only on themselves. The dark night of occupation stretched on for 3.5 years, leaving scars that would never fully heal within society. From February 18th to February 25th, 1942, the Japanese military carried out a systematic ethnic purge targeting the Chinese population, in atrocity later known as the Sukching Massacre. It stands among the 3 most brutal crimes of the Second World War. Young men were dragged to the beaches, forced to dig their own graves, and shot from behind. Amid that suffocating atmosphere of death stood a 19-year-old youth named Lee Kuan Yew, trapped atop a truck, bound for execution. At the very edge of death, the instinct to survive drove him to make a daring decision. He asked the Japanese soldiers for permission to return home, claiming he had not had time to collect his clothes and personal belongings. By a strange stroke of luck, the soldier agreed. Lee Kuan Yew went back and remained in hiding for 2 days. When he was forced to step outside again, the guards had changed and, by some miracle, they allowed him to pass. He survived, while thousands of others were left forever beneath the sands along the shore. That moment was not only a twist of fate that spared his life. It marked the beginning of a profound political awakening. Standing on the fragile boundary between life and death, the young Lee Kuan Yew began to ask searing questions. Why must we endure such humiliation? Why should the fate of an entire people be placed in the hands of outsiders? He came to understand that political power could fundamentally reshape a society's mindset and human behavior. The dark years under Japanese fascist rule taught him the harshest lesson about power of all. If you cannot defend yourself, you'll be trampled upon and forced to submit to the will of others. Lee Kuan Yew was born into a wealthy Chinese family that had taken root in Nanyang for 4 generations. He grew up under a thoroughly British education and even carried a Western name Harry. But the war swept away all illusions of civilization and the promise of imperial protection. The swift disintegration of British forces delivered a shock that never faded, driving home a single realization: Singapore's future had to be decided by Singaporeans themselves. That mission was born from the ashes of war quietly igniting within him, compelling him to seek the knowledge and tools needed to build an independent future for his people. After the dark years under the heel of fascism, when the final gunshots had faded into silence, Lee Kuan Yew understood that he needed a weapon more powerful than violence to liberate his people's intellect. With the support of his family, he set out for Britain, carrying with him a burning desire for change. He initially enrolled at the London School of Economics, but after just 1 year, he transferred to the prestigious University of Cambridge to pursue a degree in law. There, within ancient lecture halls steeped in tradition, his worldview began to shift dramatically. He encountered socialist ideas, joined the Labour Party's student circles, and gradually formed a resolute anti-colonial stance. He did not study law to accumulate wealth. He studied law to uncover the cracks within the imperial system to use Britain's own rules to defeat Britain itself. In 1949, he graduated with double first-class honors, ranking at the very top of Cambridge's law cohort, an unprecedented achievement for a student from a colony. In 1950, the young lawyer, armed with a razor-sharp mind and an iron will, chose to return home. Singapore at the time was boiling with demands for self-government, and Lee Kuan Yew knew his moment had arrived. He did not immediately step into politics. Instead, he began as a lawyer, using the law as a lever to enter the lives of the working class. The true turning point came in 1952, when postal workers went on strike to protest unjust wages. As tensions escalated, Lee Kuan Yew agreed to represent them pro bono. Rather than inciting riots, he adopted a far more intelligent and sophisticated strategy. He did not limit himself to street speeches to stir emotions. He coordinated with elite figures in the press to generate a powerful wave of public opinion. Armed with legal statutes, he confronted the British colonial administration head-on, issuing a firm ultimatum: unless fair conditions were met, the strike would never end. That victory sent shockwaves through the colony. For the first time in Singapore's history, people realized they could defeat colonial rule through intellect and the law without spilling a single drop of blood. Lee Kuan Yew's name blazed across the political landscape like a rising star. He became legal counsel to more than 100 trade unions, repeatedly defending student and labor movements. Each legal victory was not merely a personal triumph. act was a hammer blow driving deeper cracks into the pillars of colonial power. By October 1954, sensing that public support had reached a critical mass, he joined forces with British-educated intellectuals and left-wing union leaders to lay the foundations of the People's Action Party PAP. Lee Kuan Yew understood one hard truth. To gain power in Singapore, he needed the absolute trust of the Chinese majority. Yet a major obstacle stood in his way. He had grown up in an English-speaking educational system, and his limited Chinese was openly mocked by political rivals. Unfazed, he devoted hours every day to mastering Mandarin and Hokkien. He knew that language was more than a tool of communication. It was the key to reaching hearts and minds, the foundation for uniting a multi-ethnic society standing at the threshold of freedom. He entered his first election campaigns prepared to confront harsh realities head-on because he understood that Singapore's destiny now rested in the hands of those bold enough to think and brave enough to act. No matter how resounding a legal victory might be, it is still only a ripple on the surface. Lee Kuan Yew understood that to truly overthrow colonial rule, he needed a vessel large enough to carry the aspirations of an entire nation. In October 1954, amid a surging political climate, the People's Action Party known as the PAP was officially born. This was not a party for the elite alone, but an unusual alliance between top-tier intellectuals returning from Britain and fiery left-wing trade union leaders. From the very beginning, Lee Kuan Yew laid down an iron principle. The PAP must be the party of all Singaporeans, regardless of race or culture. Ideals, however, are one thing. Reality is far harsher. At the time, the Chinese community made up the overwhelming majority of the population. Yet, Lee Kuan Yew, raised in an English educational system, faced a potentially fatal barrier: language. Political rivals relentlessly mocked him as Harry Lee, a man alienated from his roots. Someone who could not even speak his mother tongue. How, they asked, could he possibly understand the people's pain? Instead of arguing, he chose silence and action. He threw himself into learning Mandarin and Hokkien with iron discipline, devoting thousands of hours so that he could stand before crowds and speak in their own language. He understood that language was more than words, was the lifeline of trust. When Lee Kuan Yew began to speak in local tongues, the barrier between a Cambridge-educated intellectual and struggling workers slowly dissolved. On the road to self-government, Lee Kuan Yew made a highly risky move by cooperating with communists to form a united front. It was a marriage of calculation. He borrowed their mass support to apply pressure on the British while keeping a firm grip on the steering wheel to avoid being dragged into extremism. In 1955, he won a parliamentary seat and emerged as the leading figure of the opposition, repeatedly flying to London to negotiate directly with the colonial authorities. The confrontations at the negotiating table in London were no less intense than the protests in the streets. He declared unequivocally that no one had the right to decide Singapore's destiny except the people of Singapore themselves. That tireless effort finally paid off in 1958, when the British were forced to concede and grant Singapore full internal self-government. The general election of 1959 became a political earthquake. The PAP won a landslide victory, securing 43 out of 51 seats in the Legislative Assembly. At just 35 years old, Lee Kuan Yew was sworn in as the first Prime Minister of the self-governing state. The image of him and his colleagues appearing in pristine white uniforms became a symbol of a clean and incorruptible new beginning. Yet the joy of victory could not erase the deep anxieties weighing on the young Prime Minister's mind. He looked at the map and saw a tiny Singapore resource port, lacking even its own supply of fresh water. A nation as small as an egg would sooner or later be crushed if it failed to find a solid anchor. It was then that the idea of merging with the Federation of Malaya began to take shape in his pragmatic thinking. For Lee Kuan Yew, this was not merely a geographic union. but an insurance policy for the island's economic survival and security amid the unpredictable turbulence of the times. The merger with the Federation of Malaysia in 1963 was supposed to be a safe harbor for a resource-poor island. Instead, it became the opening act of a turbulent tragedy. Lee Kuan Yew carried within him a powerful ideal: a Malaysia for all Malaysians where every ethnic group would be treated equally and granted the same opportunities. That progressive vision, however, collided head-on with the federal government's Malay-first protectionist policies in Kuala Lumpur. Political tensions refused to remain confined to negotiation tables. They spilled onto the streets, erupting into bloody ethnic riots in July and September of 1964. Blood stained what had once been the arteries of commerce. Trust between communities fractured, and the gulf separating Singapore from the central government widened into something impossible to bridge. Faced with instability that threatened to ignite a full-scale civil war, Malaysia's Prime Minister made a ruthless decision to preserve the Federation's stability: expel Singapore. August 9, 1965 entered history as a fateful day, but not with the triumphant cheers of a nation winning its freedom. For Lee Kuan Yew, it was a day of searing pain and humiliation. Before the lenses of national television, the Iron Man, known for unyielding resolve, could not hold back his tears. He choked as he spoke of suffering, because throughout his adult life he had believed Yinan fought relentlessly for the unity of the two lands. Being forced into independence, cut adrift from a vast common market, felt like a suspended death sentence hanging over the tiny island. Imagine the pressure bearing down on the shoulders of that 42-year-old man. He now carried the fate of millions on a strip of land lacking even the most basic conditions for survival. Unemployment was rampant. Consumer goods were in severe shortage. And most bitter of all, the national treasury held a mere 500,000 Singapore dollars, some far too fragile to run a government, let alone build a nation. Yet his greatest fear was not money or international recognition. It was the harshest survival equation of all: water. At the time, Singapore depended on Malaysia for nearly 80% of its water supply, piped in from the state of Johor. With his pragmatic, razor-sharp mind, Lee Kuan Yew understood that water was Singapore's jugular. Water scarcity posed a threat more terrifying than any weapon of war be, because if the valve were turned off, the entire island could collapse without a single shot being fired. Amid tears of anguish and the darkness of uncertainty, the Prime Minister's will was forged once more in red-hot fire. Though his heart was breaking at the collapse of the unification dream, he stood before the world and declared, without hesitation, that Singapore would survive. From that moment on, he knew there would be no one left to lean on, no path of retreat. They would have to invent a new formula for survival in a perilous world, from collecting every drop of rainwater, to seeking international recognition and a seat at the United Nations to safeguard their fragile sovereignty. Independence was not a celebration of roses, it was a fight for survival from the very first breath. Imagine a nation that could not even control the most essential element of life itself: fresh water. In 1965, 80% of Singapore's water flowed through pipelines from the Malaysian state of Johor. To Lee Kuan Yew, this was not merely an economic challenge, it was a sword hanging over the neck of the entire nation. He understood all too well that if relations between the two countries deteriorated, Malaysia would only need to turn off the tap and Singapore would collapse without a single gunshot fired. That fear haunted him so deeply that he once reflected that the threat of water scarcity was more terrifying than any weapon of war. Yet, instead of surrendering to adversity, Singapore, under his leadership, chose to fight nature itself with extraordinary discipline and creativity. Lee Kuan Yew pushed a bold campaign to transform the island into a colossal water harvesting machine. Every single drop of rain that fell on the land had to be captured. Reservoirs were planned and built across the island, expanding water catchment areas to cover nearly 90% of the territory. But they did not stop there. A revolution called New Water was born through advanced treatment technologies. Singapore achieved what once seemed impossible, turning wastewater into drinkable water so pure it exceeded the World Health Organization's international standards. From a nation once forced to beg for every liter of water, Singapore flipped the board entirely, achieving self-sufficiency and even selling purified water back to Malaysia. It was living proof that when a people are pushed to the edge, an iron will can carve out extraordinary paths forward. As the water crisis gradually found its solution, Lee Kuan Yew faced another crisis just as painful: housing. In the early days of independence, more than 500,000 Singaporeans were crammed into filthy, overcrowded slums, lacking even the most basic amenities. He understood that people could never truly commit to a nation if they did not have a stable roof over their heads to protect their families. That realization led to a sweeping public housing program with a core goal: every family should own a home of its own. The Housing Development Board was established not for profit, but as a powerful instrument of social regulation and stability. The policy transformed the city's face in what could only be described as a miracle. Within a few decades, hundreds of thousands of apartments were built and offered to citizens at prices tightly regulated by the government. Today, more than 80% of Singapore's population lives in HDB housing, and the vast majority truly own their homes. This became the keystone of social stability and public trust in the government. When every citizen owns a piece of this land, they are no longer temporary residents. They become true stakeholders ready to defend and build their country. Solving the twin crises of clean water and housing laid the most solid foundation possible for Singapore to rise, preparing the nation for its next, far more powerful strides toward order, discipline, and economic transformation. Once the most basic needs, clean water and stable housing, had begun to fall into place, Lee Kuan Yew understood that an even stronger foundation was required to build a nation that could endure discipline. Looking across Asia at the time, he saw a shared tragedy: countries rotting from within under the weight of corruption. To confront this disease, he set out to remake the very face of government. The image of PAP members appearing in immaculate white uniforms was not mere symbolism or attire. It was an oath of integrity, a public declaration that this government would be clean and beyond purchase. He granted supreme authority to the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, whose emblem, sharp sword, piercing a white lotus, sent an unmistakable message. In Singapore, no one stood above the law, and corruption was a crime with no exit. To eliminate temptation at its root, Lee Kuan Yew made a controversial yet deeply pragmatic decision: pay ministers very high salaries. He believed that if the nation wanted its brightest minds to serve the public rather than enrich themselves in the private sector, the government had to compensate them accordingly. When officials were materially secure, there was no incentive to trade honor for dirty money. This approach allowed Singapore to attract top talent, from lawyers and bankers to engineers, into public service, turning the state apparatus into a machine of extraordinary efficiency. Alongside discipline came a bold economic vision. Lee Kuan Yew knew Singapore could not survive as merely a transshipment port. He pushed aggressive industrialization, inviting global energy giants such as ExxonMobil to build facilities on the island, transforming a country without a single drop of oil into the world's third-largest oil refining hub. In just over 2 decades, from 1960 to 1983, Singapore's economy achieved a staggering average annual growth rate of 9%, a miracle the world had never witnessed in a nation so small. Yet he firmly rejected the Western-style welfare state. In his view, excessive handouts dulled human ambition and bred dependency. To bind together a multi-ethnic society, Lee Kuan Yew implemented a bilingual education policy. English was chosen as the primary language to ensure ethnic neutrality and global connectivity, while mother tongues were preserved as second languages to maintain cultural roots. His concept of discipline extended into every corner of social life through an exceptionally strict legal system. From minor offenses like littering and smoking in public to serious crimes. All faced heavy penalties, including corporal punishment. It was this uncompromising strictness, often criticized as harsh, that transformed Singapore into one of the safest places on earth, creating the ideal environment for the Singapore Dragon to finally spread its wings and soar into the open seas of the world. Singapore's diplomacy under Lee Kuan Yew was a masterclass in sharp-edged realism. He believed that in a region where great powers competed relentlessly, small states could carve out space to survive if they understood how to balance power. Singapore did not bind itself rigidly to any single camp. Instead, it skillfully leveraged the rivalries of the major powers to safeguard its national interests. When American influence spread across Southeast Asia, Lee did not hesitate to open Singapore's doors to the Soviet Union, signing trade agreements and establishing full ambassadorial relations. In fact, the Soviet Union built its largest embassy in Asia on this very island. At the same time, he was among the few leaders who openly supported the United States during the Vietnam War, allowing U.S. naval vessels access to logistical facilities in Singapore. This balancing act was so precise that even while Singapore needed military assistance, he deliberately sourced defense equipment from countries other than the United States, ensuring that Singapore retained its independence and avoided falling into any trap of dependence. His relationship with China further demonstrated his diplomatic acumen. Despite being a country with a predominantly ethnic Chinese population, Singapore maintained a necessary distance to assert its sovereign independence. Yet Lee always knew when to send carefully timed signals of goodwill, such as voting in favor of China's return to the United Nations in 1971. His fateful meeting with Deng Xiaoping in 1978 left an indelible impression. During their exchange, Lee spoke frankly, at times sharply criticizing certain Chinese policies. In response, Deng Xiaoping's humility and candor, when he asked, "What would you have me do?" deeply moved Lee Kuan Yew and earned his profound respect. Over the course of his career, Lee visited China 33 times and met with 5 generations of Chinese leadership, an extraordinary record for any international statesman. Yet behind the image of an iron-willed politician was a softer, deeply human side. His 63-year marriage to his life partner, Chu. The two had once been rivals for top academic honors at Raffles Institution before becoming lovers. In 1947, they secretly registered their marriage in Britain without informing their families, an extraordinarily bold act for that era. She was not only his wife, but his most trusted collaborator, quietly editing every speech, draft, and parliamentary note for decades. She firmly refused to move into the Prime Minister's residence, unwilling to let her children be spoiled by excessive service. Thanks to her, the family maintained a simple lifestyle in their old home on Oxley Road, where even the living room remained largely unchanged for many years. In 2011, Lee Kuan Yew formally retired from a political career spanning more than half a century. When he passed away in March 2015 at the age of 91, the entire nation of Singapore sank into profound mourning. The world bowed before a legend, a man who transformed a resource-poor island into a modern miracle. He left behind an enduring legacy not merely of skyscrapers or economic prosperity, but of a fierce spirit of self-reliance. As he once reflected near the end of his life, he had no regrets about what he had done, because the reward he received was a successful Singaporean. The price he was willing to pay was his entire life. The story of the Lion City will continue to echo through the flow of history, standing as a testament to the power of belief and sacrifice. Thank you for walking this journey with me. Please subscribe to the channel to watch upcoming videos. My sincere thanks to you all.